latitude, prevailing winds and ocean currents, mountains and the nearness to the sea. Things like that determine what we call the climate, determine what the climate of a place will be.
Welcome to Cambridge Zero Climate Talks with Antoinette Nestor
and Amy Munro.
Well, Amy, it has been a very busy week, hasn't it?
It has indeed. We have been going through all of the applications for our internship scheme for this year, and we've had so many brilliant applicants. I was A, amazed by how many people applied, but B, how many wonderful and inspiring people who want to work in this field that are out there. It was really great.
Yes, I agree. It's quite impressive, actually, how much the younger generation wants to do. The array of skills and topics and subjects where people were applying from becomes very hopeful for the future.
Yeah, I think it is a source of hope. And it's very easy, I suppose, to be very platitudinous and just say, oh, this is great. But I was just very impressed by how much people had clearly thought about it, committed to it, and engaged with all of the ideas. I thought it was really impressive.
Indeed. And talking about the future, I had a very interesting chat with Bea and Georgina from the RSPB. That's the Royal Society for the Protection of Birds. They are launching our report today, actually, about the UK land footprint called Riskier Business, the UK's overseas land footprint. And it was co-produced by the WWF and the RSPB. And you, Amy, I believe you spoke to a historian?
So I went to go and talk to a few people this week, but I think we're just going to have the interview I did with Helen and Curry, who works in the Department of History and Philosophy of Science. And we had a conversation around plant breeding and the history of plant breeding and how that relates to food security. And I was asking questions about why that might be important for our future. And we had a good conversation.
It's interesting how it all relates and all becomes intertwined. For example, with the RSPB and the report that they're launching today, and with food security. And I also spoke to Cambridge Cleantech and some of its members. Cambridge Cleantech is a network organization which supports the growth of sustainable clean technology companies in the United Kingdom. And given today's environment and the need for investing in green jobs, this is a great way of showing people in general how clean tech companies and the green economy works in practice. And all talking about how the pandemic has impacted their business and how their businesses, because they are sort of within the remit of clean tech, they are green jobs. So we had a very interesting chat, and we heard from three of their members. So it was Alex, Vicki, and Julie, and Martin, who is the CEO of Cambridge Cleantech.
If you're just joining us, this is Cambridge Zero Climate Talks on CAM FM.
I had a very interesting chat with Bea and Georgina from the RSPB.
I'm Beatriz Luraschi. I'm a Principal Policy Officer at the Royal Society for the Protection of Birds, where I focus on global climate change and biodiversity policy.
I'm Georgina. I work in the same team as Beatrice on global policy, focusing on nature and climate agreements, and I focus a little bit more on the global nature agreements.
Can you tell me what the RSPB is, please? I understand it's the UK largest nature conservation charity, but can you expand a bit more on it?
Sure. So, as you say, RSPB is the UK's biggest nature conservation organisation. We are a membership-based organisation and have over 1 million members. And the work that we do is to protect natural ecosystems and to focus on protecting and restoring species in the UK and overseas. So we work domestically across the 4 countries. We manage and run reserves. We also do a lot of policy advocacy in relevant areas. And we are the UK member of BirdLife International. So we do a lot of work with our partners globally across the high seas and in key geographies and landscapes where we work with local partner organizations, some of which are focused on birds, but many of which are also, like us, focused on broader nature conservation.
So, Bea, you mentioned the UK overseas. Now, I understand you have published this Riskier Business report, the UK's overseas land footprint. Can you explain a bit more about this overseas land footprint?
So, this report is looking at the land footprint associated with the UK trade of 7 key commodities that are often associated with deforestation. So the 7 commodities are beef and leather, cocoa, palm oil, pulp and paper, rubber, soy, and timber. And we've chosen these commodities on the basis that they are associated with the largest share of the UK's footprint. So the assessment looks at key countries from which we import these commodities and tries to extrapolate deforestation risk and social risks, human rights risks, on the basis of the size of the footprint and on the basis of risk that is derived for each country, looking at rates of deforestation, rates of human rights and governance issues. And so this gives us a picture, an approximate picture of the risk associated with the trade in these commodities. And we've done this assessment before. So we looked at data from 2011 to 2015 to look at this footprint and have expanded this analysis in the current report. And what this has shown us is that the UK's footprint has grown very, very significantly. It has increased by 15% since our last analysis, and is now equivalent to 88% of the UK land area. So in the report, you'll see some graphic representations of this, and you will see that 88% of the UK landmass is the equivalent of the land area needed to produce these 7 commodities that we import. So in the context of global climate and biodiversity emergency, that is largely driven by the destruction of nature and by the emissions associated with land use change, this is a very, very significant set of drivers that we need to better tackle. And I guess the main message from the report is, this problem, we have been aware of this problem for a few years, but the footprint and all of the negative impacts associated with it are still growing. So we need to change the way we are trying to address these issues.
That's very interesting, actually, the comparison that you can see in real scale what equates to. And among these agricultural commodities, are there any ones that are worse than others, or which one is the main culprit?
So in terms of the change over time, there has been a huge growth in the timber footprint. So timber imports have actually doubled since our previous study that was published in 2017. And this is largely due to a significant increase, a 110% increase in the imports of fuel wood. And this is because the UK uses a lot of bioenergy using timber. And this is specifically related to renewable energy policy. So energy policy in general. This is sort of an attempt to increase the UK's share of renewable energy, and biofuel being sort of a land-based commodity that can be regrown is classed as renewable. However, the greenhouse gas and biodiversity impacts are very, very significant and very negative. And a lot of these timber imports are coming from countries with high deforestation rates and risks associated with the production. So that's very interesting to note.
So Bea, in relation to the report, did you produce it yourself, or was it a work between different organizations?
So it was co-produced with WWF UK and RSPB, and we worked with the consultants at 3 Keel, who did a lot of the data gathering and have developed this methodology in our previous report to quantify the UK's land footprint.
And what about cocoa? The report mentions it as one of the commodities. How does cocoa play in relation to the land footprint or negative impact of this trade?
Cocoa is an interesting commodity in which the UK's global market share is quite large. It's 9%, which is bigger than for any other commodity, and therefore any decision that the UK could make about how to reduce the negative impacts of this trade would have quite a significant impact globally.
That's actually very interesting, because everybody lost their bar of chocolate, and what can be done to stop this negative environmental impact?
So what we've seen is over the last 10-15 years, there have been a lot of voluntary corporate commitments to end deforestation. So this problem has had some visibility, and a lot of consumers and governments and other stakeholders have been aware for a long time that a lot of these commodities are often associated with deforestation. So this has led to commitments that are often voluntary on behalf of businesses to reduce their impacts on deforestation and their other negative social and environmental impacts. One key commitment that has been reported on widely is to meet a zero deforestation target by 2020 that a lot of businesses have signed up to. And it is 2020 now. We are in the year 2020. And unfortunately, none of these commitments have been met.
So in your experience over the past few years, how do you think will level the playing field?
We've learned a lot of lessons over the last 10 years over what the really challenging bits are and why it's very difficult to make progress on this. And one of the reasons is that we don't really have the kinds of regulations that would allow us to hold companies to account and level the playing field for all businesses. So one of the things we're calling for in the report is to urgently introduce legislation to address this problem and help level the playing field for businesses to be able to transparently report on their impacts and have plans in place to reduce the negative impacts and be held to account in some way if they are unable to improve their practices.
So is this part of the international biodiversity diplomacy that Georgina, that you work with, or is it something that is a bit different from what Bea has explained to us?
No, it's very much part of it, in the sense that if the UK can put in place some of the actions that Beatriz has outlined, it would help make the case for the UK being a global leader on the environment. So that's why we're kind of calling for those different due diligence obligations and legislation, because that would help legitimize some of the claims that the UK has been making in terms of being a global leader for nature and being a global leader for the environment. So it's very much part and parcel of that as well.
So what else do you have planned for the future? Do you have any upcoming global nature or climate summits, or what else do you have in store?
Yeah, so 2020 was supposed to be, and it had been branded as something of a super year for nature and for climate action. So in the autumn of 2020, we were supposed to have 2 global summits. One was on biodiversity, so the Global Nature Convention, and the other one was on climate change, so the UNFCCC, what we call Conference of Parties, where all of the governments get together and make decisions and commitments to tackle climate change. So those were supposed to happen this autumn, and it was a particularly important year because obviously 2020 is the end of a decade. That's quite often when these global agreements have moments of renewal or uplift in ambition. So especially for the Global Nature Agreement, it was coming to the end of its 10-year period where countries were supposed to be ramping up efforts to protect and conserve and sustainably manage biodiversity globally. And we had something called the Aichi targets, which was a set of 20 global targets that nearly all countries had signed on to and committed to achieving. And we're obviously coming to the end of that 10-year period. So that Global Nature Convention was in a process of developing a new set of targets for the next decade. And this is particularly important because I think anybody who's been engaging with the news or looking at things that have been happening in the natural environment in the UK, we know that we're failing to meet those global targets. So not enough has been done globally, collectively, to meet our targets for nature. And there's been recent reports that have come out that shown that 1 million species are still at risk of extinction. Habitat destruction, which very much connects to what Bea was talking about in terms of supply chains, and our footprint overseas is still a massive problem, as well as land conversion for agriculture and unsustainable management of land. So it's an incredibly important time, and we need to get those commitments right. So those are what's still on the cards, but with a slight delay in the processes.
So will you be doing a lot of virtual events?
Yeah, it's a hard one actually, because there's some virtual events happening. So there's webinar series. If people search for them, there's quite a lot of stuff happening online actually. RSPB has run a few webinars, and if you follow our Twitter, you can get updates on those. Bea's run some webinars on the due diligence and supply chains side of things. But the tricky thing with these international negotiations is there's thousands of people involved from all over the world, and nobody seems to have really decided how that might work in a virtual setting to do those kinds of negotiations, because a lot of it depends on informal last minute conversations in the margins, or ad hoc meetings, or breakout groups, and that kind of fluidity. Nobody's really cracked how that might work virtually, hence why all of these things keep getting delayed, because they want to make sure they can happen in person.
And if people wanted to learn more about the RSPB, would they have to join some sort of local group in order to reach out to you, or how does that work?
Yeah, so there's various ways that people can stay up to date with what we're doing on the global agreement side of things, and on Bea's work as well. So all of our members get regular mailing updates. We also have several Twitter feeds, which is particularly helpful to follow. So we have RSPB, our general account, but we also have something called RSPB News and RSPB Science, which is where we put out some of our studies, where we'll promote things like the Riskier Business Report, and where we'll update blogs and other content that we do around the global agreements. Our Director of Conservation, Martin Harper, also has a blog on the RSPB website, which he frequently updates, and myself and Bea do blogs on that platform as well. So there's lots of different ways that people can keep informed or get involved.
I also believe that you have a youth council. If people wanted to wanted to learn about the youth council, I imagine they go to the website as well.
Yeah, definitely. So it should be fairly easy to find on the website, and we're really thinking over the next year, especially with these global moments and with these opportunities for UK ambition and leadership, how we can get youth more involved in the work that RSPB does. So as you've mentioned, there's already a youth council, and all of that information's on the website and on our Twitter as well. So Twitter's always a good place for information.
Excellent. And Bea, is there anything else that you would like to add?
I would definitely encourage people to see how they can get involved, or find out which local politicians they can write to about this, because despite the fact that we are in a very significant crisis that will have long-lasting economic impacts, we have a very unique opportunity to set things right in our relationship with nature. And if we don't do it now, we won't get another chance to rebuild that anytime soon.
Georgina and Bea, thank you very much for joining us today. It has been a pleasure.
Thank you very much for having us.
Yeah, thank you.
So, Amy, should we learn a little bit about history then?
Yeah, let's go for it. Today, I'm talking to Helen Ann Curry from the Department of History and Philosophy of Science. Welcome, Helen. Thank you for coming on.
Thanks for having me. It's really nice to be talking with you today.
So your current research considers the history of efforts to conserve the genetic diversity of agricultural crops. Can you tell us a bit more about this?
Sure. From about the 1880s onward, right? So for more than 100 years, plant breeders, crop scientists, agronomists, other kinds of agricultural experts have been worried about the possibility that efforts to produce better kinds of crops, the work that professional breeders do to develop hardier grains or disease-resistant corn, that those efforts put new kinds of crops into fields, but also displace older varieties, and that those older varieties might actually have genetic material within them that's useful. And so for all of this time that we've been developing improved crops, people have also been worried about losing the crops that already exist out there. And so the work that I've been doing has been studying the history of those concerns, and then also what scientists have done in response to them, what kinds of conservation measures they've taken, and what kinds of responses those conservation measures have provoked.
So why might conserving the genetic diversity of agricultural crops be important? And you said that there might be elements in these older crops that are important, but what is that importance?
The basic material of plant breeding is existing genetic diversity. That's what the people who make our crop plants fundamentally work with, and that any process of improving a variety requires having diversity to work with, right? And so we can think of all the variety in crops that exist in the world as this fundamental kind of substrate on which agriculture then continues to develop and change over time. And so a worry that people often have is that if we are not conserving that diversity, if we're not stewarding it and making sure that it's available for breeders to use and for farmers to grow, it'll disappear. And then as conditions change, for example, with climate change, and we need crops that perform in different ways than the ones we're growing right now, if we've let the older varieties disappear, we won't have the genetic variation within them, and we'll be constrained in agricultural development in ways that we weren't before.
Interesting. So what have you found out about the history of efforts to conserve genetic diversity of agricultural crops, and what have scientists been doing to try and do this conservation?
So a lot of my research has been really thinking in part about the stories that we tell about why crop diversity is disappearing, and the way in which those particular stories shape the things that scientists do. So you can turn to a lot of different outlets to hear the story that I've just told about diversity disappearing, right? And it's almost a kind of one-size-fits-all story. And it's the same story as told in 1880, that's told in 1920, that's told in 1960, that's told today, right? And yet, it hasn't always been the case that crop diversity has kind of disappeared in the way that scientists claim and imagine it might be, right? So the story is more complicated than a one-note story of loss or this kind of declensionist tale. And so part of what I've been doing in my research is to try and think about basically how we tell new stories about what's happening with crops in the field in order to produce new kinds of conservation action. And I'll just give you kind of one example of that, right? One of the dominant responses that we've had to the idea that crop diversity is disappearing is a kind of salvage response. So going out, gathering as much diversity as we can from fields before it disappears in the way that we imagine it might, and putting it basically in cold storage, in a refrigerator or a freezer, and hoping to extend its lifespan as long as possible. Now that's all well and good, and we might really want to make sure that things are saved in the freezer. But that's a response that only makes sense if you think there's no possibility that diversity can survive in the field, right? And so if we understand that there are places where diversity continues despite agricultural change, or we see that we might want there to be more diversity out there in the field than there is, then we need to have a different kind of conservation response. And so part of what I'm doing is trying to create a different story about what's happening to crop diversity in the field in order to kind of help scientists reconfigure their conservation responses, maybe to give us different options than we now have.
That's fascinating, because actually, if in that example, if you just put seeds into the freezer, then you essentially stop evolution there, and you don't allow new genetic diversity to be generated. Whereas if you allow plants to interbreed with one another, who knows what might come up that could be really, really useful to us. And actually maybe studying both of those things is really important. That's a really interesting way of thinking about it.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, this is not novel to me. This is something that various different kinds of natural scientists and social scientists have been saying, probably since about the 1970s. But it's a message that sometimes gets lost in the kind of urgency of loss.
Yeah, absolutely, and understandably so, I think. So moving on slightly, the new project that you're launching this year will be looking at food security. We'll be looking at food security as well as crop diversity. So what's the motivation to understand this?
So one of the main claims that's made, for example, about, if you've heard of the Svalbard Global Seed Vault, this is this Arctic cold storage facility for seeds, and the justification for building that facility, for making sure that all the world's seed collections are backed up there, is that crop diversity is essential for food security, right? And so what I'm going to do in the project is really look at historically how scientists have used and managed crop diversity, and think about the ways in which that has or has not historically contributed to the crops that we eat on a daily basis. We invest huge resources in crop diversity and making sure that it exists, in trying to evaluate it, in shuttling it around the world without also transmitting plant diseases. And yet we don't really have historical narratives that link all those up and then see how they link up with food security. So the aim of the project is really to try and put those pieces in place.
And do you have any ideas yet of how crop diversity and food security will be related when you look into it? I know it's very early days.
Well, undoubtedly they're related, right? I mean, the foods that we eat are diverse in their origins and from different parts of the world, and breeders really do, as I said, rely on having different kinds of what they refer to as germplasm, but genetic material available, right, as the basis for what they do. So they're undoubtedly related. I think the question is really about whose labor and whose ideas and whose work kind of creates something valuable out of crop diversity. There's a kind of narrow story that we tell, which is that breeders themselves are the ones who, well, farmers on the one hand and breeders on the other are the ones who make crop diversity into something valuable by either breeding plants over successive generations or stewarding land races in the field so that they can continue to evolve in place. But actually there's a huge public infrastructure for crop science, and it's been whittled away, especially since the 1970s, as private industry and agribusiness has just ballooned to an extraordinary size internationally. So really thinking about what those public investments have done historically for us is, I imagine, what one of the most important payoffs of the project might be. Because if we lose sight of how important it is to be creating public science and to be investing in agriculture in a really sustained way, then we risk putting the developments that we've had in agriculture really at risk.
So that really speaks to my next question as well, which is, are there lessons we can learn from the history of food security and genetic diversity of crops about our current food security position and steps we might like to take in the future?
Yeah, I think that's one of the things that comes out of thinking about the history of agricultural science in a sustained way. The history of the 20th century, or the first 8 decades of the 20th century, was really the history of public agricultural science. Huge transformations happened, many of which are contested, but we fundamentally transformed our capacity to make food for the world. The system by which that food is created has taken a dramatic turn. And so if we really value what we've put in place and we think it's important for sustaining lives and livelihoods in the future, we really ought to understand in rich detail how that system came to be, because I think it'll give us the possibility of making a case for public science moving forward.
That's really interesting. And this is a follow-on question which we haven't discussed. But thinking about the stories, are you also looking to understand the stories of people who were engaged in agriculture through those periods of time, who maybe participated in agriculture prior to all of that public investment, and how that's influenced their productivity as well, or their own farmed productivity?
I think, so there's a corresponding history of basically agrarian life, right, of farmers, as you're just pointing to. I think my own interests are especially in understanding agricultural science and scientists and what work they've done. But obviously those two communities are closely related, and at various times have been more closely related than they perhaps are now. So yes, it's part of the story as well.
Interesting. So final set of questions. I noticed that you're also involved in a virtual reality game called Seed, which I was totally fascinated by. So what was the aim of this game?
Sure. Yeah, this was a game that was developed by the company All Seeing Eye, and it was part of a competition run by the Wellcome Trust and Epic Games to incorporate research into the development of a game, in this case, a virtual reality game. So we worked together in making a game that actually allowed the player to be immersed in plant breeding. And obviously the overarching objective was to have fun, but an underlying idea was that most of us are completely unfamiliar with the idea that the food we eat every day is the product of someone's actual engagement in a process of developing that plant over time, right? There are many people who probably don't realize that the job of plant breeding exists, as a possibility. And so getting people to think about this as a task that is done and is carried out in a fantastical setting, with some elements put in just for the fun of gameplay, but still this kind of basic underlying idea of plant breeding as a thing that we do and that we need to do.
That's fascinating. It speaks to a project that I've been involved in myself earlier this year, which was our competition for students, which was called the Carbon Challenge competition, where we got students to think about designing games or coming up with game concepts that spoke to decarbonisation. And I think there's so many interesting parts of that about how people learn, for example. And if you take a topic that can be complex and you get people to engage with it in a gamified way, then actually they have to use that information very, very quickly in a way that they might not do in a classroom, and how that changes their learning outcomes and what they think of that subject, I think can be very valuable in terms of a way that people can learn and to motivate action as well.
Yeah, absolutely.
Fantastic. Was there anything else that you wanted to say or that we missed?
No, not at all.
Brilliant. Thank you very much for coming on.
Thanks for having me. It's been great to talk with you.
If you're just joining us, this is Cambridge Zero Climate Talks on CAM FM.
And if people want to get a hold of us, Amy, or if people want to send us their feedback or want to know something about climate talks or about Cambridge Zero in general, where they should get in touch?
They should email us at info@zero.cam.ac.uk.
I spoke to Cambridge Cleantech, and they have different businesses who are members. So we had an interesting chat with 3 of their members. So I chatted with Vicki McGregor, Marketing and Bids Director at Merit, Alex Newman, Innovations Director at Propelair, Julie Chen, the co-founder and CEO of the Cheeky Panda, and Martin Garratt, who is the Chief Executive of Cambridge Cleantech. Martin, Vicki, Alex, and Julie, thank you very much for joining us today. And to start, Martin, what is Cambridge Cleantech and when and how did it all start?
Well, thank you, Antoinette. And may I first of all add my warm welcome to this CAM FM Cambridge Zero Climate Talk. I'm delighted to be here today. So how did we start? We started about 10 years ago in Cambridge. I used to run the broader economic partnership in the Cambridge sub-region. And we decided to morph into Cambridge Cleantech with the demise of the RDAs, or the Regional Development Agencies, as they were known at the time. And I'm delighted to say that the University of Cambridge has been a founder member since day one. So we've been working with the various departments and teams at the university for the last decade.
And so for our listeners, we have a few of the members of Cambridge Cleantech with us today. So to start, we hear more and more about investing in green jobs and green technology. So how have each one of you responded to the pandemic? Alex, I'll start with you first.
Certainly. So during the pandemic, we've really used the time to be able to focus a lot more on innovation. I suspect many people have found that, unfortunately, the day-to-day hassles have gone away for a little while, but that has given the benefit with innovation that we really can focus on our innovation program. And there's two key areas. So certainly hygiene has really jumped to the top of the list, I think, for many people in the current environment. And our toilet, we're glad to say, the way that we flush with air and water, thereby reducing the water flush down to 1.5 litres per use. But when you actually look at the statistics, certainly a recent journal article in the Journal of Physics stated that toilets can throw a plume of aerosol spray up to 91 centimetres in the air. And there's a suspicion that they can carry the likes of germs for COVID-19. So we really are focusing on the development of the toilet lid. Now, we have to close our lid anyway as part of the design to ensure the air does go down the toilet. But currently, we still have to touch the toilet lid. And whilst there are lots of studies that explain how keyboards are still far dirtier than the toilet lid, customers don't really like touching the lids. So we are really progressing aspects of an auto-open close lid with the view of bringing that to market as soon as possible to be able to reduce the impact, the need for people to actually touch toilets unnecessarily. So that's one area of focus. And another area of focus is for us the use of IoT connectivity. Again, if we look at washroom management and the development of technology in the IoT arena, the ability to be able to monitor what's going on in a washroom environment and ensure that the toilets are up and running as soon as possible, and should there be a fault, that people are alerted and can come and fix it, can help keep a toilet that much running more effectively, efficiently. The downtime is less. So they're the key areas that we're focusing on at the moment.
And Julie, what about yourselves? How have you responded to the pandemic?
Yeah, so thank you for the question. We, Luraschi Panda, produce ultra-sustainable tissue paper and biodegradable wipes from bamboo. Everything we produce is made from bamboo because bamboo grows 30 times faster than trees. Our wipes are biodegradable, unlike 90% of the wipes in the market which contains plastic. We are an eco-friendly company. During the pandemic, the demand for our products became really high due to panic buy. So we had a very big increase in sales online as well as Amazon, and we then had the opportunity to launch with a USA company and also a China company as well. So we actually, during this pandemic, we launched into 2 other big markets, USA and China, as well as some other European countries like Czech Republic. The demand for tissue paper during this time is very high, and the change we have to adapt is that with a small team, we can't really cope with so much work and so many client requests coming from different countries. So we had to employ more people.
Wonderful. And Vicki, what about yourself? The same question. Can you tell us about your product and how have you responded to the pandemic?
So we are design and build complex environments, so basically clean rooms and laboratories, and we've been doing that sort of more in a traditional approach for a number of years, but sort of 2018 provided a catalyst for us through a number of advanced technologies to enable for us to to provide a slightly different offering, and that's in off-site construction. So with that brings a number of sort of environmental benefits, as well as sort of delivering a project much quicker. It's no surprise that obviously the construction industries accounts for quite a large effect on the environment. So what we're doing now is we're able to build facilities quicker, but we're also, in terms of material usage, waste, we're reducing all of that. Carbon footprint's reduced because we've got less operatives on site. We're aiming for about 75 to 80% of buildings are built in our factory, then they're transported to site. So the effects on the environment, as well as the client getting a quicker time to use facility, it's a win-win for everybody, including the planet, really. So we're advancing ahead, so all good.
And Martin, in relation to the pandemic and green technology and green jobs, how do you see this as an opportunity, perhaps a silver lining into Cleantech? Can you tell us a bit more about that?
That's a very good question, Antoinette. I was just reflecting only earlier this week that prior to the pandemic, we had, this week, 12 months ago, we had David Attenborough appearing at Glastonbury. We had Greta coming over from Scandinavia and then traveling on to New York in a sailing ship. More recently, again before the pandemic, we had the forest fires that you may remember in Australia and similar bushfires in California. And we had people sticking themselves to tube trains in London. That's all just 3 or 4 months ago. So it seems a while ago, but it's not that long ago. Then we had the pandemic and the downturn as a result of that. But just more recently, we've begun to hear from some of our political leaders who are really sort of making sure that the climate agenda comes back to the forefront. So, for example, we had the French automotive industry requesting funding from the French president, who said, yes, you can have the funding, but only for electric vehicles from now on. And similarly, the recovery plan within the European Union is now called the Green Deal. So you can see the direction of travel there. And earlier this week, we had Rishi, our Chancellor, talking about energy efficiency in homes and the program he's putting in place for that. And only a week prior to that, he was also talking about the new green industrial revolution in the UK. So I think the signs are that as we move forward and we start the recovery, that the climate change agenda will be the top of everybody's minds. What we don't want either as communities, as academics, as political leaders, as business leaders, we don't want to see a situation in 5 years' time where we're back to an international economic downturn caused by, for example, climate change leading to migration movement, leading to civil strife, leading to a downturn in the economy. So it's right back up at the top of the agenda again, and I'm very hopeful for the future.
And now, in relation, when we talk about climate change and environment and sustainability, I was wondering, how does each one of you, the work you do and the companies you represent, how do you all see climate change and environment and sustainability playing a part in what you do every day? Vicki, I'll start with you first.
In terms of where we are at now, we've actually developed a number of products which deal specifically with infection control, which obviously will be helpful in the fight against COVID-19. And, and in terms of any other pandemics or anything that's, going to turn up, but we're not over it yet. I just saw something pop up about an A&E hospital being closed down and things. So our focus on technology is these. We've got an ICU hotel which we're developing, and that would provide, basically it's a clean room environment, but it's a hospital. So I think there's a figure of 2.7 billion cost to the NHS every year for C. diff and norovirus. So we're really looking at how we can limit these infection controls and how long people are staying in hospital. In terms of the environment, we are, as I say, every day sort of developing new products that not only provide, commercial aspect, but also the environmental aspect. So, that's important to us as a company. So, it's good to be able to provide something that's quicker time to use, but also meets a number of environmental targets. We work with government departments as well as, being able to support private sector clients their environmental issues as well.
So during the pandemic, were you able to do more work, or did you have to stop a bit and now you're restarting again?
No, again, it was one of those real turning points for us where we, in terms of the pandemic, have really been able to sort of answer to a lot of the problems. So we've been looking at building COVID-19 testing labs, vaccine manufacturing facilities. And we're now looking to patent some of those technologies, because we're able to offer flexi-pods, ATMP hubs. We're also doing UK BIC's battery facility in Coventry, and we're doing that through quite a unique model. So we need to sort of protect our IP at this moment as well. So, a lot of these new approaches have been as a result of COVID-19, but also, as a result of our experience to date. So.
And you did mention your carbon footprint. So how can you expand a bit more on how your work relates to issues of climate change, the environment and sustainability?
Yeah, so in terms of what we're doing in terms of building these modules in our factory, it creates a win-win solution in terms of the effects on the environment. So there's less material usage. The guys who are at the factory, that would probably be the number of guys that would be on site as well. So there's less people travelling to site, in the install. It obviously just takes a little bit less time.
And what about you, Alex? How does your work relate to issues of climate change, environment and sustainability in general? How does that play in your company?
So for Propelair, we design commercial toilets, and ultra low flush commercial toilets. So we reduce our water use from a typical 9 litres per flush down to 1.5 litres through a patented technology that uses a combination of air and water. If you look at the stats, and I was rereading them again before the interview, they're stats that turn around and suggest that the UK is going to be water-starved area, about 50% water-starved by 2025. That by 2040, I saw some stats here that turned around and said about half of the world's population won't have adequate access to water sources. So for us, when you look at that and you look at the stats that again in the UK, 140 litres of water per person is used, water per person per day, and out of that, some 48% I think is for toilet use. So we see the fact that we are flushing drinkable water straight down the toilet, a very valuable world resource, is something that needs to be addressed. So we think that our product really does start to attack some of the issues to do with water use. Certainly, again, there are stats that suggest that that water use has increased some 600% since the 1960s, and is predicted to rise again between 2020 and 2050 by about 55% globally. So we're attacking that area of conserving what is a very, very valuable resource for the world by reducing the amount of water that we put down the toilets, just down to 1.5 litres. At the same time, we actually reduce the carbon footprint of a toilet flush, because obviously there's carbon that's used to create clean water. So the less water that we use, the less carbon is actually used per flush. So we kind of hit it in those areas, reducing water, reducing carbon, and protecting a valuable resource for the world. As our strapline says, we believe we are saving the planet one flush at a time.
That's actually, that we don't really think about saving the planet and toilets. It's something that, perhaps we should think more about, where flush the toilet every day and you just don't really think about it. And what about you, Julie? We don't want to have conversations about toilets, but it seems like, we are talking about toilets. So yeah. What about yourself, producing wipes and loo rolls?
Yes, exactly. Our product is related to toilet as well, because one of our main products is toilet paper. It's quite a big issue because 27,000 trees are cut down to make normal toilet paper every day. So the Cheeky Panda use an alternative resource, which is bamboo. bamboo is not like trees, it's a grass. So you cut it, it grows back. The harvesting process is very good for the environment. It absorbs 4 times more CO2 and produce 30 times more oxygen than an equivalent of trees. So with this process, the harvesting process of bamboo and the use of bamboo to make tissue paper is more eco-friendly than regular trees, because there's a huge issue with deforestation nowadays. And with our increase in sales during this pandemic, we actually make some more donation to charity partners. We kind of align our business goal with UN's 17 sustainable goals. So when the company become bigger, then we have the power to make more impact. So every goal we want to partnership with a charity, and the revenue that we make, the profit we make, part of it can go to support, for example, no poverty, zero hunger, good health and well-being. So we want to support these 17 goals, and using our power, using our message, our resource. This is the what we want to achieve with the Cheeky Panda.
Martin, in relation to the future of Cambridge Cleantech, how many companies do you have at the moment?
We have about 300 companies plus in the Cambridge region, which are members, and we have something similar in Oxford because we set up Oxfordshire Green Tech as well. We run that with partner organisations in the Oxford region, but our databases are much bigger than that. We probably have a database of about 5,000 or 6,000 companies between Oxford and Cambridge, and we also do some work in London. So effectively beginning to create almost a green triangle, if you will, between London, Oxford and Cambridge and back to London. We think that's a good opportunity for the future, sort of a super cluster. And what we're really trying to do is provide business support for our members to climb out of the impact and move on from the pandemic, because whilst the government interventions have been helpful, they're not going to be around forever. And the furlough scheme, for example, is winding down by October. So we've really focused on 2 things: contract opportunities and access to finance. So in fact, just before the pandemic, we had our Cleantech Venture Day in central London. At the offices of KPMG, we had over 20 companies pitch from an application of over 100 companies wanting to pitch. Judges picked out the 20 most investment-ready companies. They pitched on the day, a room full of investors, and as a result of that, some of those companies have got funding to grow in the future. That's one way. Just earlier this week, we held another event which is related to our second priority, which is contract opportunities for companies in the cluster, and we held that in conjunction with the Department for International Trade. We had about 40 innovators from the Cambridge region listening to the innovation shopping list, I'll call it, from 4 corporates, 3 from Germany in the sort of production arena in manufacturing, and 1 from the Netherlands, which was actually the Rotterdam The Hague International Airport. They were looking for renewable technologies and smart building solutions. So we hope as a result of that, that type of initiative, some of those companies, some of the innovators will end up with contracts with the corporates. But I'll just finish with one last example. Cambridge Display Technology, which are one of our associate founder members, they were a start from the Cavendish labs at the University of Cambridge in the late 1990s. They eventually got bought by Sumitomo Chemical of Japan, a very large corporate from Japan, and they've just, they've now become effectively the R&D research arm for Sumitomo Chemical, and they put in place an innovation shopping list, a challenge or a call out to our innovators, and they're looking for solutions in those areas I mentioned in relation to batteries and storage technology.
Wonderful.
It gives a good picture.
Indeed. And as a last question, and it might be something that you're not expecting, but that's maybe that's the nice thing about the last question. If you had a magic wand or something to look into the future, what would you like to see in the world happening?
That's a great question to finish off on, Antoinette. I would be delighted and over the moon if somebody could come up with a solution for energy storage. We have so much distributed energy or renewable energy being produced at the moment. It can't all feed into the grid because the grid isn't smart enough, and we're having the resultant microgrids being created, which might be helpful in the locality, but it's probably not helpful in terms of balancing the grid across the country. If we only had some reliable, low-cost solution for storing all of this energy being produced, that would be a real solution to drive forward the sustainability agenda.
Wonderful. And now, Vicki, what about you? What would you like to see?
Yeah, I think from our perspective, it's that people could learn about what Merit are doing, and that we can offer, you know, an environmentally impressive building that's, you know, great performance, long term, and that's something that we're finding that people don't really know about us. So from our perspective, it would benefit everybody. You know, we can achieve the construction sector deal, but we're often up against government and public sector. They're not open to these advanced modern methods of construction. So, you know, it's something that we're ploughing on with, but that would be our magic wand moment, is that more people knew about what we had to offer.
Excellent. And you, Julie?
Yeah, I would like to see less trees being cut down, less forests being burned, less pollutions in the ocean. This is the goal of our company, and it's what I would like to see.
Brilliant. And Alex, last but not least?
Thank you. No, I think, you know, over the pandemic, the last 3 months, I think people have been able to take stock at just how the environment has been impacted by the pandemic, in the sense that, you know, we've actually seen cleaner rivers, cleaner water. We've seen the impact that the reduction in transport and energy use has been fantastic. And so I think it's a good chance for people to reflect and understand what they can do to actually impact on the environment. And then, you know, relating to all of our companies, and certainly, you know, in the case of Propelair, to actually see that there is technology out there that people can invest in. They can invest in our toilets, put our toilets in, and actually a lot of these technologies, ours, for example, is certainly mature enough where you get a good payback. So there is actually a business and an investment case. And here we are now already talking about how do we revitalise the economy, and how do we actually get over the fact of this 3 months where, you know, really there's going to be a downturn now, is we can actually revitalise the economy by investing in green products, putting Propelair toilets in, and using, you know, the products that we've been talking about today, to boost the economy and gain the benefits, the environmental benefits that we're all looking for. So I really do hope that after the last 3 months, that's something that we can all work towards achieving together.
Indeed. Well, thank you very much to you all. It has been wonderful to have you on in a very different type of radio interview.
Thank you, Antoinette.
Well, Amy, hopefully the weather will improve for the weekend.
I think by Saturday, I had read on the forecast.
Oh, excellent. So, well, have a lovely weekend, whatever you do, and chat next week then.